Hello, everybody. We are back with. Hold on, I think I'm going to start again. Hello. Hello, everybody. We are back with Godwin's law, that inevitable law that you can't have a conversation on the internet without bringing up Hitler. And we're going to do it right from the beginning. Of course, we live in an age where everyone's obsessed with Hitler. Some people compare him with Donald Trump, which seems particularly absurd. Americans are obsessed with the revisitation, in a manner of speaking, of Nazism in America. But all this obviously is overdone. Sometimes, perhaps always. One man all too familiar with Hitler and Nazism is my guest today, Richard J. Evans. He's perhaps the world's leading historian of Nazi Germany. He's the author of the Third Reich trilogy, which many people consider the classic on Nazi Germany. Has a new book out, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. And Richard Evans is joining us from North Hertfordshire, just outside London. Richard, before the Nazis and the Godwin's law about Nazis, was there an equivalent? Were people, for example, before the 1930s, did they always bring up Napoleon or somebody else to talk of evil?
They certainly did. I mean, through the 19th century, British children were frightened by their parents by being told, unless you're good, Boney will come and get you, meaning Napoleon Bonaparte. So that was quite an equivalent figure.
It's interesting because I'm not sure if you've seen Ridley Scott's latest film about Napoleon. I actually rather enjoyed it. It was entertaining, but certainly not profound. Napoleon was treated as a rather absurd figure. Could you imagine in a couple of hundred years we have an equivalent film about Hitler being a rather pathetic fellow?
It's been made already.
Evil.
It's been made already by Charlie Chaplin, The Great Dictator. That's a satire on Hitler and the Nazis. So it's not the first time it's been ridiculed.
But not so much ridiculed as marginalized, turned into a kind of footnote of history.
I think that has been a claim. Of some extreme right-wing commentators and politicians, but I don't really think that's going to happen. I think the Nazis' evil, fact that they killed 6 million Jews deliberately and for no other reason that they were Jews, that they launched the hugely destructive World War II, those things alone, I think, have damned them to eternal infamy.
Richard, you've dedicated your life to the study of Nazi Germany. You've written other books as well, but your name is always associated with the Nazis. Why did you do this? Did you always set out? Were you always fascinated as somebody growing up in Essex from parents who were Welsh? Were you always obsessed with Hitler?
Yeah, well, we lived on the fringes of the East End in London, so we used to go there, Leytonstone, Leyton, Hackney, and so on. And I would see, even when I was 4 or 5 or 6, it was very striking, the bomb damage in the East, still in the 50s, which had taken out houses from rows of terraces and so on. And I wondered who'd done this. And why, where did all this come from? And then, of course, my parents had been in the war in one way or another, and their friends and all the politicians and major figures had been wartime figures. So it was a big theme. If you grew up in the post-war years, like a baby boomers like myself, then it was a major thing, and that got me interested in it. And then when I got to Oxford as a student in the mid to late 60s, then, of course, German history was just waking up from a long slumber caused by the unwillingness of the Germans themselves to confront their recent past. And so it becomes a very, very exciting time to get involved in German history.
Extremely exciting. There were great debates in the 60s and 70s, which you became embroiled in, about Nazi Germany. Perhaps you might remind our viewers and listeners of what those debates were about, the historiographical situation, if you like, that you found when you entered the field?
Yeah, well, it was the 70s by the time I did my doctorate. And at that time, then there was brewing up a huge controversy in Germany itself. First of all, about the long-term origins of Nazism. Did it go back before World War One? And I was fortunate enough to know and study with Fritz Fischer, who was a very, very controversial major historian in Germany, who argued yes, and younger historians joined in, and that then the books about Germany's aims in the First World War, for example, with comparisons and with Germany's aims in the Second World War, and Imperial Germany under the Kaiser as a kind of antechamber to Hitler's Third Reich. So I got involved in that. And then in the 80s, there was a so-called historians' dispute, which in Germany itself, again, in which some conservative historians tried to draw a line under the past, encouraged, I have to say, by Ronald Reagan, who wanted to strengthen West German consciousness and against the threat from the evil empire in the East. So all that was very, very exciting.
I've been listening to an excellent podcast on the origins of the First World War. The rest is history. I'm sure you're familiar with that podcast. You've probably been on it. What's your take on the causes of the First World War and the connection between the catastrophe of the war, particularly in Germany, and the rise of the Nazis?
Well, the origins are a different matter in a sense, because it's a very chaotic set of circumstances in which I think everybody, all the participants, had some axes to grind and some war aims, including France and Russia and Britain. But by the time the war was over in 1918, it was a catastrophe for Germany, an unexpected, sudden, complete defeat. And the peace settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, of course, then took away 13% of Germany's territory, banned Germany's manufacture and use of combat aircraft and capital ships. It was and restricted the army size to 100,000 people, 700,000 men. So it was a bitterly resented. It came as a surprise to the Germans, because the army who were running Germany by 1918 effectively had refused to admit that they had any problems at the front, had painted a picture of Germany inevitably going to win until just a few weeks before they had to admit defeat. So it was a trauma. And I think that is the key to Nazism, the rise of Nazism.
Does that, I've got to be careful here. You're a veteran of these kinds of conversations. Does that give some degree of moral excuse, though, for the rise of Nazism? The appearance to many Germans that they didn't really lose the war, that they were stabbed in the back, that the origins of the war are still massively debated. The idea of Germany being evil before the First World War that may have been put forward by the French and the British doesn't seem particularly convincing these days. Does that give some sort of moral excuse for the rise, at least, of Nazism, of the anger, of the hostility to the West, of the obsession with rearmament?
Well, there was a French historian who once said, to explain everything is to excuse everything. But that's not really true. I think you can explain things and adduce larger factors, etc. But in the end, we all make our moral choices. I could quote Karl Marx here. People make their own choices. They make their own history, but not under circumstances of their own making. But that doesn't reduce them to mere creatures of history. We all have a degree of moral autonomy. So, and you also have to remember the Nazis never won more than 37% in a free national election. So the majority of Germans all voted always against the Nazis, as long as they were free to do so. So I think that's a kind of difficult question, but in the end, the great majority, even of those Germans who fought at the front in the First World War, were not Nazis. They were socialists, they were communists, and we have to explain it while we remember that basic fact.
You just quoted Marx. You've written a book on Eric Hobsbawm, one of the most distinguished, if not the most distinguished Marxist historian of the 20th century. I'm sure you knew him very well. I'm a friend of his daughter, as it happens. What school of history, the Marxist school, the British empirical school, what school do you think does the best job of making sense of the rise of fascism and Hitler in particular?
Well, there's a real problem with Marxist interpretations of the rise of Nazism, because all Marxist historical explanations, including those of Eric Hobsbawm, whom I did know and wrote a biography of, they all depend on class. It's class conflict as the motor of history, and you cannot explain the rise of Nazism by that, because racism and racial prejudice and anti-Semitism are central aspects of that, and you can't write anti-Semitism off, which after all led to the death, deliberate murder of 6 million Jews in the Second World War by the Nazis and their allies. You can't write it off as an expression of class conflict. You've got to look to other things. So I'm not sure you can talk really about schools of history. I mean, you can sort of talk about class, but it doesn't explain everything. It's clear, and a massive amount of historical statistical work has been done on this, that the Nazis were predominantly middle class, but they also had quite a lot of support from other social classes, including the working class as well, the unorganized, ununionized working class. So class does not really work as an explanation.
Is a central issue then, Richard Race? We're going to come to Hitler's People in a few minutes, your new book, The Faces of the Third Reich. Perhaps we can join the dots in terms of their obsession with race, in particular with the Jewish question. The Jewish question, of course, always existed in, to use a euphemism, in the 19th century, with massive amounts of anti-Semitism, both in Central and Eastern Europe. Is that, for you, the thing that most defines the rise of Hitler and Nazism?
Well, again, you have to remember anti-Semitism was not pervasive or all important in pre-Nazi Germany. The Jews in Germany were less than 1% of the population, and they were scapegoated by Hitler largely on the basis of this crazy conspiracy theory that Jews everywhere, simply by nature of being Jews, were trying to subvert and destroy Western civilization, particularly German civilization. So anti-Semitism is common to all the people. My book is a collection of just under a couple of dozen biographies of Nazis from the top, Hitler, begin with Hitler, down to the lowest level of perpetrators and sympathizers and fellow travelers and so on. And they all, to some degree or other, were anti-Semites. They bought into this conspiracy theory. But during the last elections of the Weimar Republic, the free elections from 1929, 30, 31, 32, the Nazis played down their anti-Semitism because they realized it was not particularly popular in Germany. As soon as Hitler came to power, it was blasted out. This paranoid anti-Semitic conspiracy theory from every corner of the mass media, the educational system, and all the rest of it.
I don't want to bring up Trump too many times. He's perhaps the Hitler of our age, and God with his law. But might it be similar in the way in which Trump seems to be playing down the abortion issue in the upcoming American election?
Well, I think parallels between Trump and Hitler are quite misleading, really. As Mark Twain is supposed to have remarked, Hitler never repeats history. History doesn't repeat itself. But
that was a Freudian error, Richard. Hitler doesn't repeat himself.
Yeah, well, I was going on to say something else about Hitler. So history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And so Trump and Hitler, you can see a determination to destroy democracy, to establish an authoritarian state, to suppress opposition in one way or another. But Hitler was far, far more extreme than Trump. Trump doesn't go around murdering his opponents, which Hitler encouraged from the very beginning, from the 1920s onwards, even before he got into power. Trump is not someone who proposes to put Jews in concentration camps and kill 6 million of them. And perhaps the most important difference is that Hitler, like other fascists in the 1930s and other authoritarian leaders of that era, is a product of World War I. And Hitler put he put war, expansion, nationalism, and conquest and militarism at the center of his beliefs. So Hitler, he says this so many times, it wants war. He wants a European war. He wants never-ending war. Only through war can a people like the Germans, he says, continue to be tough. And the survival of the toughest and the fittest is what he's looking for. So Trump's an isolationist. Trump wants to withdraw American involvement in the rest of the world. He certainly does not want to invade and conquer Mexico or Canada. So quite the contrary. So there are really big, big differences. That doesn't mean that Trump is not an enemy of democracy. It clearly is. And if you look at the kind of tactics of falsification, manipulation, lies, and so on that he uses to try and get support, and would, if he became president, I think, implement in his next second presidency. I think all of that is common with Hitler, but there's so many differences as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I've always thought that comparing Trump to Hitler is an insult to the legacy or the crimes of Nazism, but Trump seems such a buffoon. But you mentioned Charlie Chaplin, who presented Hitler as a buffoon. There must have been a point in the 1930s where the consensus was that Hitler was just a buffoonish demagogue who would end up in a ditch somewhere. Was that was there a consensus in the 30s, Richard, on what would happen to Hitler?
I don't think so at all. No, there's a massive amount of misunderstanding of Hitler in the 30s. He was seen as somebody who wanted to right the wrongs of the peace settlement of 1918 to 19. So that's what appeasement meant. Appeasement meant, and championed by the British Conservative government of Baldwin and Chamberlain, and also by the French with Daladier in the vanguard, if you gave in to some of Hitler's demands, the incorporation of Austria into Germany, the incorporation into Germany of the German-speaking borderlands of Czechoslovakia, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, which the 1918-19 settlement had made German troops withdraw from. All of that was thought, well, the First World War settlement had been based under the influence of President Wilson of the United States on the principle of national self-determination. So all Hitler seemed to be going for was to gathering German speakers, cultural Germans from other countries, and put them back in Germany. And remember, these are new, weak countries: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria. They didn't even have they didn't have a huge amount of sympathy in other parts of Europe. Did it become clear, particularly in March 1939, when Hitler then invaded the non-German speaking part of Czechoslovakia, that Hitler was about more than that. So there was a lot of sympathy for him and sympathy for the circumstances in which he'd come to power. And politicians in the West maybe didn't like the violence that Hitler unleashed upon his opponents in the 30s, but they thought that would all calm down after a while. I don't think anybody thought there would be a war until quite late on in the 30s, apart from Winston Churchill, who could see what was coming. And that's part of the reason, of course, why he is regarded now as a great and perceptive statesman who I think was the right person to lead Britain in the years of the Second World War.
Final question, Richard, on broadly before we get to Hitler's people. You noted that Hitler fetishized war. He'd been in the First World War. He'd seen the decimation at the front. and fascism or Nazism was driven by young men who had come back from the war. Why did they create such a cult of war, given how appalling the First World War was? Perhaps the worst war, the most terrible war, the greatest slaughter in human history. It wasn't a heroic war at the front, was it?
No, it became mechanized, didn't it, and impersonal. There's a German quasi-documentary novel by Ernst Junger that portrays that very clearly. Storm of Steel, it was called. Well, again, you have to remember that the majority of front soldiers in the First World War, for German frontline soldiers, did not become Nazis. They were social democrats and communists. There's a generation after 1918 who were just too young to fight in the war, and a lot of them again had a kind of determination to rescue Germany from the humiliation that it had served. But quite a few of them again became communists. So Nazism had different generations of people in it. I think it's a creed that emerged gradually in the 1920s, and if you look at those individuals whom I study from at every level of the Nazi movement, they all came from conservative nationalist backgrounds. There's not a single ex-communist or ex-socialist amongst them. Germany was a very, very divided country in the 1920s, and that was part of Hitler's message. Was he was going to unite the country again. That was a big part of his appeal. I mean, I went back to the sources and I sort of plowed my way through all of his speeches and his writings, and it was a major message in the late 20s and early 30s. I will unite the country. I'll break down these barriers again.
Yeah, we're hearing that message from lots of politicians today. We have the great honor of speaking to Sir Richard Evans. He is the author of an important new book, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. He's probably the world's most respected authority, historian on the Third Reich and Hitler. And his new book, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich, joins the dots between, quite literally, Hitler's people. I remind everyone that great guests, amazing guests like Richard Evans are brought to us because of our friends at the Liberties, a quarterly of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Richard J. Evans to talk specifically about Hitler's people. Don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We have the great honor today of talking with Richard J. Evans, the world's leading authority on Hitler and Nazism. He has a new book out, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. Richard, does Hitler have a person? Is there one single associate, follower of Hitler who somehow captures everything about Hitler's people? Is there a Hitler person?
I missed that, I'm afraid.
Let me repeat that.
Yeah.
You've written this book, Hitler's People, which is the faces of the Third Reich from his associates, his followers. But is there a Hitler person? Is there one face of the Third Reich that somehow reflects Hitler's people?
No, I mean, I got these biographies to point out, first of all, that these are human beings. Hitler and the leading Nazis and others who followed them have been demonized far too much. Of course, demonizing, saying that they're crooks, they're criminals, they are a gang, they are people who are in some way or another psychopaths. All of that, I think, has been done far too much. And because it has the effect of distancing them from us. These are not like normal people, so we can simply avoid the question of what makes a Nazi. So what part of my aim here is to humanize them, which is quite controversial in the literature, especially in Germany, but to portray them as human beings. And of course, as human beings, there are a large variety of people. There are come from different backgrounds. Almost all of them are middle class, I have to say. I've also tried to undermine the common belief that these come from outside the mainstream of German society. You look at them, they're not marginal figures. Their backgrounds, their families are solidly middle class. A lot of them had what you might call the bourgeois accomplishments. So piano players, they played the violin, they recited music, they wrote poetry, all that kind of stuff. They lived solid middle class life. But also common to a lot of them was that they had suffered some kind of major social downfall, crisis, trauma in their lives. Like some of them, you look at some of them, father had been arrested for a crime, they themselves had been thrown out of their jobs, all sorts of things like that. And Hitler was able to link those personal traumas up with the national trauma of defeat in 1918 to 1919.
We mentioned the Marxist school of interpretation. You dismissed the class analysis, but there's a cultural school too, the Frankfurt School, people like Adorno, who seem to suggest that in Nazism you saw somehow the cultural corruption of what they termed bourgeois Europe, the bourgeois world, in the way in which, as you suggested, Hitler's people, the Goebbels, the Himmlers, the strikers of the world, and we'll talk about one or two of them individually in a second, in the sense that they were middle class and came out of standard middle class life and had piano lessons. Does that lend any credence to the Frankfurt School analysis of Nazism?
Well, the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer in particular, argued that there was a kind of the authoritarian personality, which they identified with the Nazis, was the product of an authoritarian families, of fathers who beat their children, for example. And although that was not so unusual in pre-1914 Europe, you can't actually say that Nazis people who become Nazis are distinguished by the fact that they were beaten more often than other kids. You just can't know the detail at all. And it's a really rather implausible argument, I think, because it doesn't draw any kind of distinction between people who became Nazis and people who didn't. I don't doubt that a lot of leading communists in the Weimar Republic, and it was a major political movement with mass support, had been treated rather badly as children. It doesn't really explain very much. What I think does explain some of it is the fact, as I said, quite a few of the Nazis suffered some kind of trauma in their childhood or family disaster, or like Reinhard Heydrich, for example, one of the main figures in carrying out the Holocaust, had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy, or Robert Lai, who's a now rather largely forgotten but very important figure in Nazi Germany. His father had been arrested and jailed when he was a child, and so on. So, what I found that very, very striking. And Hitler himself, of course, was grew up in a respectable middle class family. His father was a customs officer in Austria on the borders of Germany, and he was by the time he was in his 20s, he was living on the streets practically. He had to live in a men's home for a while, didn't have a job, eking a rather frugal living until he got a legacy from one of his relations. So he'd suffered a social decline and crisis as well. And so in his speeches, he constantly reiterated a parallel that he drew between his own personal circumstances, which had now become much better, of course, in the 20s, and those of Germany and the Germans. And that runs a thread right through these biographies.
I know you spent some time with Martin Amis, the author of The Zone of Interest, an interesting book on a novel about Rudolf Höss, who you're all too familiar with. Of course, it got made into a very controversial, and I thought brilliant movie by Jonathan Glazer, which controversial for all sorts of reasons. Do you think that movie and the Amos book, they're very different enterprises, the book and the movie. Do they reiterate your argument about the normalcy of Nazis?
Yes, to a degree. I think, in fact, the movie slightly overdoes it, not as much as the book. I helped Barting. I knew him already, and so he asked me if I would, if I'd run through the manuscript, and I found about 50 mistakes, which he very gratefully accepted corrections to. And I think it's a brilliantly written book, as with everything that Martin Amis wrote. But I do think it's quite morally problematical, and that, of course, gives it a lot of its power and makes it thought-provoking. The film is also, I think, very, very thought-provoking, but it does sort of avoid some of the problems that the book got its way into. The book's about love. How can you have love in an environment like Auschwitz? The movie does sort of link up bourgeois normalcy of the home life of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, with his perpetrating of the most appalling horrors. And it does it in a lot of very subtle ways. You hear shooting and screaming, for example, noises off. Auschwitz and its mass murders are kind of created. They're like a Greek tragedy where the action actually happens off stage, as it were, but you're left in no doubt as to what is going on. So I think it's an important and very interesting, thought-provoking film.
What's morally problematic about the Amos novel?
Well, as I said, I think it is portraying these figures as just normal human beings without any problems. They're falling in love, they have human emotions and so on. And if you look at the autobiography of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, you see that what he's doing in the camp, the mass murders, the cruelty of the camp, does have an effect. He's complaining. I don't think it's an excuse. He's saying it has an awful impact on his personal life. It's really kind of destroying his marriage. And I think the contrast as I said, in the movie, even more in the book, is really overdrawn between bourgeois normality and absolute criminality. The fundamental point is one that I would agree with, I think. That is to say, these are human beings. They're not psychopaths or monsters in any general sense. I mean, I quote a journalist who attended a trial of some of the concentration camps at Auschwitz in Frankfurt in the 1960s. And he comments on these former camp guards who'd committed the most appalling atrocities and murders and beatings and torture, how they appeared in the court 20 years on as kind of like clerks and professionals and just ordinary citizens. And that concealed this past of the most appalling nature.
What do you make of the Arendtian thesis of the banality of evil, of Arendt's work and her analysis? Is that in some ways reflected in your book, Hitler's People, Hannah Arendt's analysis, that people were simply obeying what they were told?
I think I do discuss it at some length because I have a chapter on Adolf Eichmann, and Hannah Arendt, who is a German Jewish philosopher, she attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the main perpetrators of the Holocaust, the man who organized all the transports and so on. And she makes this comment about the banality of evil, but I don't think that what you said is an accurate view. I think there are a lot of misunderstandings of what she meant. There was a lot of desire in the 1960s to portray these men as absolute monsters beyond the pale of humanity. And here he was in his glass-fronted dock in the trial in Jerusalem, looking again just like a kind of pettifogging clerk. He didn't seem out of normal. Didn't seem abnormal, psychopathic, or anything like that. And that's really what she's commenting on. She's not saying that he was just obeying orders. That's a very widespread excuse given by Nazi perpetrators when they came to trial. And that isn't true at all. People ordered to shoot Jews, for example, were able to say no without any consequences at all. They just resigned and off they went. Eichmann was an ideologue, and Arendt is perfectly well aware of this. He's a man who is he's not just obeying orders. He is an enthusiastic ideological Nazi, and that's what he's doing. So that's what it looks like. It seems to be is normal. That's the problem that Arendt was wrestling with.
Is that one of the problems, Richard, with bringing these people, so to speak, to justice? Eichmann was tried, and when you bring an old man into a court, as you suggested, he appears more normal. He appears like a clerk.
Well, he's not old. And one of the things about the Nazis is that they were all very young. So, when they were former Nazis who'd survived and were brought to trial in the 60s and 70s, they were still middle-aged people. They weren't ancient. And of course, the fact that some of the trials continued into the 1990s shows that by that time they were old.
As a sense, we talked about Martin Amis's book, Zone of Interest. I thought in reading it that there was, at least in some of the characters in the book, a sense of great guilt in Hitler's people and some of the characters you cover, Goebbels, Himmler, Streicher, Eichmann, of course. Was there any sense of guilt of this historic crime that these men collectively committed?
Well, I quote some of Heinrich Himmler's speeches during the war, which are very open about how they are shooting people into pits, how they're massacring huge numbers of Jews in Eastern Europe. And he says the SS remain honorable and remain decent, which he means, and it's not an accurate perception, I think, but he means that they didn't kind of plunder them, didn't abuse them, didn't steal from them, and so on. None of that's true, really. But he argued that this is maybe regarded as a crime by the rest of the world, but it's a historical necessity, he says. He says that the SS are carrying out an historically necessary crime in a way, he sort of admits it, by murdering millions of Jews. Now, quite a few Nazis committed suicide at the end of the war. Joseph Goebbels' wife, Magda, for example, wrote a letter, very revealing letter, to her son by her first marriage, where she explains that she is going to kill her and Goebbels' 6 children because life will not be worth living after Hitler goes. And this kind of fanaticism, a bit like a cult, a religious cult which self-immolates when it can no longer carry on. It's inability to live, to envisage any kind of life after Hitler's gone. And you find these suicides. Himmler commits suicide, Goebbels commits suicide, Hitler himself, of course, commits suicide. Many generals, top civil servants, top Nazi officials, they kill themselves. Those who remained showed virtually no sign of remorse, as far as I can see. They regarded themselves as victims. I even quote Karl Brandt, who eventually, he was a leading surgeon in Nazi Germany, and he, by a series of chances, he ended up by running the Action T4, it was called, after the address, Tiergartenstrasse 4, of Hitler's HQ in Berlin, killing by gassing or poisoning or starving up to 200,000 mentally ill and mentally handicapped people. And he didn't see that as a crime at all. He thought he was still ranting on as he climbed up the scaffold after he'd been found guilty of murder, multiple murders.
That doesn't sound very normal, very bourgeois to me, Richard.
Well, in the circumstances of the time, you see, almost everybody, almost the whole medical profession, not just in Germany, regarded the improvement of the human race by eugenics as a major step forward. And that's people on the left as well as on the right. They thought that if you can eliminate defective human beings, you can perfect the human race. They couldn't see that everybody, including the mentally ill and the mentally handicapped, had rights and were human beings. They disqualified them as human beings. And Brandt on the scaffold was ranting on so much, the executioner lost patience and put the black hood over his head and pulled the lever. So, and that's true of many others. And that's one of the most disturbing things about the whole phenomenon.
What has it taught you, Richard? You've dedicated your life to studying these men, Goebbels, Himmler, Streicher, Hitler. What has it taught you about the human condition? As you say, you are growing up in Essex. You saw bombed out East London, Leytonstone. But what does it teach you, or what has it taught you about evil? You seem to be suggesting that it's somehow, if not normal, understandable.
Well, as I said earlier, it's not the case that to understand everything is to excuse everything. You have to look at the historical circumstances, and that's one of the most important things. We are in, we have violence all around us. We have violence in ourselves, and we can recognize these tendencies. We can control them and deal with them. That's, I think, a very important lesson. Another important lesson is that disqualifying people as human beings, calling them vermin or lice or insects or parasites, as the Nazis called the Jews, that is the first step towards actions of mass extermination. And that's where we have to draw the line and say, no, this will not do.
Are you suggesting then that we all have a little bit of Hitler or Goebbels or Himmler or Streicher or Eichmann in us? That we're all capable
yes.
of those kind of crimes?
Potentially, yes. It's just the circumstances are entirely different, of course. But yeah, we all have a potential for good or evil. And it's up to us, really, to make sure that the good wins out and that we do good rather than evil.
Is there an acceptable face of Hitler's people? I know you have a chapter on Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's movie documentarian. Were there some of Hitler's people were more morally acceptable than others?
Not to us now, I think, but certainly in their own time. So Riefenstahl's film, Triumph of the Will, which is a propaganda film about the 1934 Nazi Party Congress. I mean, now I find it rather boring. But in the 30s, it won several international prizes for a documentary film. There were aspects of Nazi Germany that were widely admired at the time: social policies, welfare policies, building, the more general admiration among many people inside and outside Germany of the Nazis' energy and their zeal. So I think it's nowadays, of course, we know how it all ended, but at the time, and that's what you have to do as a historian, you have to what things are like at the time and not see them totally in the perspective of hindsight. At the time, nobody really knew. Very few people guessed about the terrible death, destruction, mass murder, and
well, Richard J. Evans, the author of Hitler's People, I was going to say you'll have to come back on and talk about the Third Reich again, but I know you're tired of it. Your next project is on pandemics. Have you had enough of Hitler and his people?
For the moment, yes. I mean, I wrote my 3 big volumes on the Nazis, and then I turned to other subjects, which I thought would be more agreeable, like Nazi century, European history, conspiracy theories, for example. So I did turn away, but I was brought back to this subject by changes in